Midnight choices. Sundarpichai rubbed his tired eyes and glanced at the digital clock on his desk. 11:58 p.m. The office was empty, silent, humming only with the low buzz of machines and monitors. Outside the tall glass windows, the city lights flickered like distant stars, and inside the heart of his company, Astrobyte, everything seemed to stand still. He was used to being the last to leave, being the first to arrive, being the one everyone leaned on when the stakes were too high. Astrobyte, his ambitious rocket company, had become the crown jewel of global innovation. What started as a risky leap from his success in tech had turned into the world's most promising space venture. The Mars rocket, Nurman, was scheduled to launch in just a few hours, the culmination of years of sacrifice, sleepless nights, and brilliant minds. But tonight, something was off. A red notification flashed on the control panel, drawing his eyes instantly. Critical malfunction. Stage 2 igniter compromised. His heart thudded. The second stage igniter, if it failed mid-flight, the rocket could disintegrate. Worse, if it malfunctioned on the pad, it might explode before liftoff, right in front of the world's media. Thousands of jobs, millions in investment, and the credibility of his entire company were on the line. He reached for his phone to call mission control when it rang, an incoming call from an unknown number. He hesitated, answered. "Hello." A woman's voice, shaky, urgent. "Mr. Pichai, I'm calling from Mercy General. Your ex-wife, Layla, she's been in a car accident. It's serious. She's in critical condition." Sundar's chest tightened. He stood still, frozen, like gravity had shifted in an instant. "And your children?" "All three were in the car. 2 are stable, but your youngest, Arav, is asking for you, over and over." His breath caught. For years, he had tried to balance everything, being the visionary, the CEO, the father, the ex-husband who still deeply cared. It was never easy. Time had always been the currency he couldn't afford to spend freely. And now the universe was demanding something he wasn't prepared to give. A choice. Stay here and try to save the launch, the lifeblood of thousands, the dream he had nurtured with bleeding fingers and burning passion. Or walk away. Go to the hospital, hold his son's trembling hand, face his ex-wife's fragile condition. Be a father, not a CEO. His phone buzzed again. Another emergency call, this time from the launch director. "Sundar, we've got a problem. A serious one. The software update didn't sync properly. If we don't fix it now, we'll miss the Mars launch window for another 2 years." 2 years. He closed his eyes. The room spun. He whispered to himself, "Why now?" Memories came rushing in. His early days in India, growing up in a small house where electricity came and went. How his mother used to light candles during power cuts and told him bedtime stories about the stars. How he used to sketch rockets in the margins of his school books. He had made a promise to himself then. He would reach those stars, no matter what. But no dream, not even one etched in childhood wonder, came without a price. And now the bill had come due. He paced the room, every footstep heavy with the weight of history. In one ear, the launch director begged for direction. In the other, a nurse's voice cracked as she said, "Sir, the doctors need to know if they should prep her for emergency surgery. They need next of kin approval. That's you." His hand trembled. Sundar wasn't a man who broke under pressure. He had survived media storms, corporate wars, tech failures, and betrayals. He had built and rebuilt companies with quiet strength and unshakable focus. But tonight he was just a man, and he had no idea what the right decision was. Then, a small voice broke through his thoughts, a voicemail. From Arav. "Papa, Mama won't wake up, and they won't let me hold her hand. Please come, please." He replayed it 3 times. Then he walked to the glass window, staring at the empty road that led to the hospital on the hill. He spoke to no one, just whispered, "What good is reaching Mars if I lose my world here on Earth?" He made the call, canceled the launch. There was silence on the other end of the line. Confusion, shock. "Sir, are you sure?" "We can't cancel it," Sundar said, his voice calm but firm. "Lives are at stake, not just up there, but down here. And right now, the only mission that matters is my family." He hung up, grabbed his coat, and ran. That night, the headlines exploded. Sundarpichai halts Mars launch hours before liftoff. Stock crashes 19%. Astrobite faces turmoil as rocket grounded. Insiders stunned. Why did the tech titan walk away? What the world didn't know yet was that the story had only just begun, and the man they thought they understood was about to show them a side they had never seen before. Not just a leader, not just a billionaire, but a father, a human, a soul willing to sacrifice everything for love. And it would change more than just one company. It would change the way the world defined success. The quiet ride and the louder truth. The night air outside bit through Sundar's coat as he stepped into the black-towned car waiting outside the Astrobite headquarters. The driver didn't speak. He didn't have to. The weight of silence was already sitting heavy between them. Sundar leaned back in the seat, eyes closed, but rest didn't come. Sleep had no business chasing him tonight. As the car sped through the nearly empty streets of Palo Alto, his mind wandered through 1,000 memories and 1,000 regrets. Images flickered like a broken film reel. Layla laughing at a joke he barely remembered. Arav's tiny fingers gripping his thumb for the first time. An old photo of his 3 kids sitting on the roof of their house, wrapped in blankets, watching a meteor shower while he pointed up at the sky with wide, dreamy eyes. He used to believe that time could be managed like code. Efficient, logical, programmable. He thought if he just optimized enough, scheduled tighter, multitasked harder, he could be everywhere at once, building rockets and bedtime stories, changing the world while staying close to the heart of it. But that belief had shattered slowly, painfully. Layla had seen the cracks long before he did. She had once told him, not with anger but with sorrow, "You don't even realize when you're leaving people behind, Sundar. You just keep walking towards something bigger. But someday you'll look back, and there'll be no one left there." He didn't argue then. Maybe because deep down, he feared she was right. He opened his eyes just as the car pulled up to the hospital's emergency wing. Bright lights glared harshly against the dark, sterile building. The kind of place that didn't just smell like antiseptic, but like uncertainty. Like people holding their breath, waiting to find out if their whole world would fall apart. He walked in quickly, quietly, nodding at the nurse who recognized him instantly, but chose not to say anything. Sometimes, even fame has no power. Not here. Not where machines beep and bodies break and life hangs on by a thread. A nurse led him to the pediatric unit first. "Your son, Arav. He's shaken, but physically okay," she said softly. "He hasn't spoken to anyone, but keeps asking for you. His sister, Anika, has a sprained wrist. Your eldest, Rihan, has a mild concussion. They're together in the family room." "And Layla?" Sundar asked, his voice barely more than a breath. The nurse's face changed, and her silence was louder than any words. "She's in surgery. Internal bleeding. The doctors are doing everything they can." He nodded once, then walked slowly toward the family room like a man approaching the edge of a cliff. When he stepped in, his daughter Anika looked up first. Her eyes were red, puffy, but alert. She jumped up and wrapped her arms around him without a word. Rihan, his eldest, sat beside the window, staring out like he was trying to disappear into the darkness beyond the glass. He didn't look at his father, but Sundar didn't push. Arav, his youngest, sat curled in the corner, a blanket draped over his shoulders, clutching a small plush rocket, one Sundar had given him last year after a tour of the Astrobite hangar. "Papa," he whispered. Sundar dropped to one knee and opened his arms. The boy flew into him like a missile, holding tight, crying hard, loud sobs that tore into Sundar like nothing else ever had. Not business losses, not failed prototypes, not public humiliations. Nothing hurt like this. You came, Arav cried into his shirt. I thought you'd be on the rocket. No rocket matters more than you, Sundar whispered, kissing his hair. Nothing in this world. For the next hour, he held them all. Just sat there, grounded in a moment he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. No phones, no emails, just the sound of his children breathing, the weight of their fears, and the fierce, unspoken love that had always been there, just buried under the noise. A doctor came in around 3:30 a.m. He looked tired, solemn, but calm. She made it through the worst, he said. The next 24 hours are critical, but she's stable. Sundar exhaled slowly. He hadn't even realized he'd been holding his breath. Can I see her? The doctor nodded. Briefly. She's not awake yet, but sometimes, even unconscious, people know when someone they love is near. As he walked down the quiet hall toward Layla's room, Sundar thought about the call he had made just hours earlier, the canceled launch, the stunned silence from his team, the fallout that was already beginning online, investors pulling back, board members panicking, social media turning into a battlefield of opinions. He cracked under pressure. He's lost his edge. The beginning of the end for Astrovite. He didn't care. Not now. He stepped into the room and saw her. Pale, bruised, tubes and wires like a cruel web across her body. It hit him hard. This woman, this fierce, brilliant, once-upon-a-time best friend, had been the center of his universe once. And even after everything, she still mattered. He sat beside her, took her hand gently. Hey, he whispered, you're stronger than anyone I know. Don't leave yet. The kids, they need you, and so do I, even if I never said it enough. Even if I was too stubborn to admit that I missed the life we had. Her eyes didn't open, but her hand twitched, just slightly. He smiled, through tears. I called off the launch, he said, because for once I chose not to chase the stars. For once, I chose Earth. I chose us. He stayed there until dawn, and when the sun rose outside the hospital window, it didn't feel like the end of something. It felt like a beginning. That morning, news cameras swarmed outside Astrovite headquarters. Headlines screamed, investors raged, and competitors rejoiced. Everyone had a theory. Some said Sundar had lost control. Others said he had cracked. A few called it a publicity stunt, but they didn't know what was coming. They didn't know that Sundar's decision, born out of love and sacrifice, was about to ripple across the world in ways no one could have imagined. Because real leadership, the kind that truly lasts, doesn't just launch rockets. It heals families. It inspires people. It reminds the world what really matters. And Sundar Pichai, the man who once defined success by what he could build, was about to redefine it by what he could hold on to. Echoes of the world he left behind. The hospital cafeteria smelled faintly of old coffee and sleepless nights. Sundar sat alone at a corner table, a forgotten tea in front of him growing colder by the second. Outside, the sun had begun its slow crawl across the sky, but inside him, time felt still. Strange, how the most important moments of a life never came with fireworks or fanfare. Sometimes they arrived in silence, in stillness, in the aching pause between one breath and the next. He had barely slept. His children were resting now, tucked into the temporary pediatric recovery ward, and Layla remained unconscious but stable. For the first time in what felt like a century, there were no meetings, no countdowns, no breaking news at the edge of his inbox. Only the rhythm of a quiet hospital and the slow reassembling of something long forgotten. Family. A nurse passed by, recognizing him, but didn't stop. That was the strange thing about fame. It could fill rooms and still leave you completely alone. His phone buzzed. Again. And again. He picked it up reluctantly, scrolling through messages. A board member. We need you to make a public statement. The market's still in freefall. His public relations director. Astrobyte's reputation is on fire. They're saying you abandoned the future of space travel for personal reasons. Please advise. His assistant. The CEO of Orbix just did a press conference. They're offering to absorb Astrobyte's Mars tech into their system. They're calling it a gracious rescue. Rescue. He stared at that word. As if choosing his family had meant he had failed. As if compassion was weakness. As if love was a thing you could only afford when the quarterly reports were green. He put the phone down and let it buzz itself into exhaustion. He stood up, stretched his legs, and walked down the long hospital corridor that still smelled faintly like antiseptic and uncertainty. He found himself at Layla's room again. Machines still hummed softly beside her, keeping rhythm with a body that had refused to give up. He looked at her face, so still, so familiar. And in that moment, guilt curled itself deep into his chest. He should have been here before. Years ago, not just now, in crisis. They had tried once. Layla and him. They had tried to make marriage work while he built Google into a global force. Tried again when he moved into space exploration. But slowly, gently, they had drifted apart like two astronauts tethered to different planets. And still, despite the distance, she had never stopped believing he was a good man. You always wanted to touch the stars, she had told him once, after their final divorce hearing. But Sundar, it's okay to land sometimes too. He never forgot that. Just buried it. Under deadlines. Under speeches. Under press releases and success stories that didn't include her or the children. A soft knock came on the door. Annika peeked in. Papa, she said, there's a man here to see you. He says it's important. Sundar frowned. What man? He said he's your old mentor. From college. Curious, Sundar stepped out into the waiting room. And there he was. Professor Rajan. His old mentor from It Karikpur. Older now, with white hair, and the same kind eyes that once lit up in dusty lecture halls when Sundar would raise his hand one more time, hungry to understand. To explore. To dream. They embraced briefly, awkwardly, as men who haven't spoken in years tend to do. How did you find me? Sundar asked, surprised. I've been following the news, Rajan replied gently. And your assistant said you were here. I flew in this morning. Sundar gestured for him to sit. Why now? He asked. Because I know what you're about to do, the professor said, looking straight at him. You're going to walk away. Not just from the rocket, but from the company. Sundar looked down. They think I've already done that. No, Rajan said, what they think doesn't matter. What you believe does. So tell me, Sundar, do you believe you failed? The question cut deeper than he expected. I don't know, he said honestly. I just know that, for the first time, I made a decision not based on logic or ambition or pressure. I made it because I wanted to be there. For my children. For Layla. And that choice, it felt right. It felt like breathing again. Rajan smiled, and there was something proud in that smile. Like a teacher watching a student finally solve the problem that had haunted him for years. Then maybe, he said, you didn't walk away at all. Maybe you finally showed the world what leadership really looks like. They sat in silence for a while. The hum of the hospital, the echo of footsteps, the occasional laughter of children in recovery somewhere down the hall, it all created a strange kind of peace. You know, Rajan added, we always used to say, reach for the stars. But no one ever asked us to remember the people holding the ladder. Sundar nodded slowly. Later that day, he would walk outside into a media storm. Reporters shouting. Cameras flashing. The world waiting for a statement. He stepped up to the podium outside the hospital gates. No suit, no speech, No polish, just truth. I canceled the launch, he began, because I realized that the most important thing I've ever built isn't a rocket or a company, it's a family. And when they needed me, I had to show up. Not as a CEO, but as a father, as a human. Reporters tried to shout questions. He raised his hand. I know there will be consequences, financial, professional, personal. But if this is the price of showing my children what love looks like, I'm willing to pay it. We'll rebuild. We'll try again. But not at the cost of what truly matters. And with that, he walked away. Back into the hospital. Back to his kids. Back to the only mission that truly counted. Storm after stillness. 2 days passed. Layla was still unconscious, but her vitals held steady. The doctors said that was good news. Cautious optimism, they called it. Sundar stayed by her side when he wasn't with the children, quietly watching over her, answering medical questions, adjusting blankets, brushing stray hair from her forehead. Time, once measured in rocket stages and quarterly milestones, was now counted by beeping monitors and the slow rise and fall of her chest. The world outside didn't wait, though. It never does. Astrobyte's temporary shutdown had rippled across the tech world like a thunderclap. Investors held emergency meetings. Government contracts were put under review. News anchors speculated endlessly. Some praised him as a rare leader with real priorities. Others tore into him as reckless, unstable, even weak. Hashtags surged, headlines screamed, and in boardrooms across the world, his name was no longer a symbol of certainty. He heard it all, but chose not to respond. What stung more than the media was the quiet betrayal of people he had trusted. His co-founder, Viren, who had once been his college roommate and later his right-hand man, was now rumored to be working on a buyout plan behind his back. A document had leaked, plans to transition leadership from Sundar to a new executive team with more crisis discipline. Sundar wasn't shocked, but he was hurt. They had built Astrobyte together, shared ramen noodles in cheap motels while pitching investors, worked 80-hour weeks side by side. But somewhere along the way, things had shifted. Maybe it was the fame, the pressure, the money, or maybe it was just that not everyone's dream stretches in the same direction forever. Still, he didn't confront Viren. Not yet. Not while Layla was still in a coma. Not while his children needed him whole. One morning, as he sat in a hospital courtyard, sipping bad vending machine coffee and watching the sun rise through branches heavy with dew, Annika came out and sat beside him. "Papa," she said softly, "why do people think you did something wrong?" He looked at her. 12 years old, far too perceptive for her age. Her eyes searched his face, like she was trying to understand a world that didn't always reward the right choices. "Because," he said slowly, "sometimes when you do something good, it doesn't look good to everyone else. Sometimes doing the right thing means losing things that are important to others, things they don't want to let go of." "Like what?" she asked. "Like power, money, control, image." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "But you didn't lose us." He turned to her, touched. "No," he whispered, "I didn't." That night, Layla stirred for the first time. Her hand moved. Her eyelids fluttered. Sundar was by her side in seconds, calling the nurse, heart pounding with cautious hope. When her eyes finally opened, they were unfocused at first. Then slowly they found him. She looked confused, then worried. "Kids," she croaked. "They're safe," Sundar said, choking on the lump in his throat. "They're all okay." A tear slid down her cheek. "And you?" He smiled gently. "Still here." A nurse came in, gently checking her vitals, explaining the situation. Layla drifted in and out, but she was lucid enough to understand she had survived something serious. And Sundar had been there, really there. Not on a call, not in another country, but beside her. Later, when the kids came in and the room filled with quiet sobs and soft voices, Something settled in Sundar's heart, something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. And still, the outside world waited. Decisions had to be made. Companies didn't pause for long. Life never asked permission to move forward. So the next morning, for the first time in nearly a week, Sundar put on a blazer and left the hospital. He didn't go to the headquarters. He went to an old co-working space in downtown Palo Alto where he had first pitched Astrobyte, back when all he had was a rough sketch of a modular rocket design and a deep, wild belief in humanity's future among the stars. He booked a room, sat down with a pen and paper. No assistants, no board, no noise, just him. He wrote, for hours, ideas, visions, truths, lessons, not just about space, but about people, about failure, about love. And then he called a meeting, not with the board, not with the media, with the engineers, the interns, the janitors, a heart of Astrobyte. They met in a rented hall behind a high school auditorium. No stage, no suits, just chairs and purpose. When Sundar stepped in, he didn't speak for 5 minutes. He just looked around the room, looked at the faces that once lit up when he entered, now mixed with doubt, fear, even resentment. He understood it. Then he began. I made a choice, he said, to be a father when I was needed most, and I won't apologize for it. The room was silent. I know some of you think I abandoned the mission, that I betrayed the dream. But what good is building rockets to Mars if we can't build a life worth living down here? His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. We lost a launch. Yes, but we haven't lost our purpose. I haven't forgotten what we started this for. Not to be first, not to be richest, but to be better. Better humans, better leaders, better explorers. And that starts with being brave enough to admit when you need to stop and hold the people you love. A young intern raised her hand, shy, hesitant. Sir, are you coming back? Sundar looked at her, then at the rest of them. Only if you want me to. And slowly, one by one, they began to clap. Not loud, not dramatic, but real. The kind of applause that builds, not just in sound, but in soul. A message from those who still believed. And in that quiet gymnasium, among folding chairs and dusty banners, something awakened again. Astrobyte wasn't dead. Not yet. Because Sundarpichai hadn't walked away. He had just come back in a different way. Ashes and blueprints. It had been 11 days since the canceled launch. The news cycle, once obsessed with Sundarpichai's decision, had begun to move on. There were new scandals, new heroes, new distractions for the world to devour. But inside Astrobyte, the silence after the storm still echoed in the halls. The screens were no longer alive with countdowns. The hangar smelled of cold metal and lost momentum. Sundar returned to headquarters not with a dramatic entrance, but with quiet purpose. The building felt different now. It wasn't the structure that had changed. It was the energy. He walked the floors slowly. Past cubicles, engineering bays, glass-walled conference rooms, and empty whiteboards. He greeted people by name, shook hands, thanked the janitors, stood for minutes beside junior engineers just to listen. The same man who used to schedule his days down to the second now paused to ask how someone's mother was doing in surgery or how someone's child was adjusting to kindergarten. He wasn't just rebuilding a company. He was rebuilding trust. And not just from others, but within himself. Layla had been moved from the IQ to a regular room. She was healing, her body bruised, but her spirit unbroken. They spoke daily now. The conversations were awkward at times, unsure, like relearning an old language. But there was a warmth beneath the words, like coals waiting to be stirred back into fire. Their children noticed the change. Rihan, who once barely made eye contact with his father, now lingered a little longer in rooms with him. Andika asked to ride with him to school. Arav, sweet, wide-eyed Arav, had taken to drawing pictures of rockets again, but this time with stick figures of his family waving from the launch pad. Sundar pinned one to his office wall. The media began shifting the narrative. Slowly, a respected columnist wrote a piece titled, "Maybe the world needs more sundarpichais." It spread, quietly, then loudly. His choice, once ridiculed, was now being debated in boardrooms. What did it mean to lead with empathy? What was the real cost of ambition? And more importantly, what was it worth? But not everyone celebrated his return. The board remained split. Viren, once his closest ally, had grown colder. There was no outburst, no confrontation, just a quiet wall that had built itself brick by brick between them. They sat across from each other during the first official leadership meeting since the cancellation. "We've lost momentum," Viren said plainly, "and market faith." "We've lost more than that," Sundar replied. "We lost sight of who we are." "And you think one speech in a gym changes that?" Viren asked, voice edged with disbelief. Sundar didn't respond immediately. He looked at the team, engineers, designers, managers, assistants, all of them watching, waiting. "No," he said softly, "but one moment of truth can be the start of something better." The room didn't erupt in applause. This wasn't a movie. But no one interrupted him again. Later that night, Sundar stayed behind. The office was empty again, just like the night this all began. He walked into the design lab and stood before the prototype model of the Nurman rocket, the same one that was supposed to carry human dreams to Mars, the same one that had nearly been destroyed by one tiny, overlooked fault. He touched it gently. "You'll fly," he whispered, "but not like before." And just like that, he made another decision. Not a reaction, not a compromise, a choice. The next morning, he called an all-hands meeting. He stood in front of his entire company, hundreds of faces, both in person and on live stream, and did something no CEO had done before. He apologized. Not for the launch, he clarified, but for building a company so fast, so big, that we stopped asking why we were building it in the first place. "I lost sight. I asked too much from too many. And somewhere along the way, we stopped caring for each other." A heavy silence followed. And then he continued, "From this day forward, Astrobyte is not just a space company. It's a humanity company. We will build rockets that care for life, not just seek it. We will build missions that serve the planet, not just leave it behind. And we will build a culture that values families as much as it does fuel efficiency." He paused, then smiled slightly. "And we're going to do it together." After the meeting, people didn't return to work immediately. They stood around in clusters. They hugged. They cried. They looked each other in the eyes, as if something sacred had returned to them, not just purpose, but permission. Permission to be human in a world obsessed with speed. Astrobyte wasn't fully healed. Not yet. But the blueprint for its future had changed. And it began not with thrust or algorithms or hardware, but with heart. The stars, this time with meaning. Weeks passed, not in a blur, but in moments, each one deliberately lived, carefully placed, like the slow and patient stitching of a torn fabric. Sundar's days had changed. He still arrived at the office early, but now he stopped by the daycare first to drop off Arav, who had decided, without asking, that he was going to help build rockets like Papa. Sundar smiled every time he saw the boy march through the sliding doors like he already had his own badge. On some mornings, Annika joined him, carrying books and coloring pencils, staying near while Sundar took calls in smaller, quieter conference rooms. Evenings were different too. There were no more dinners alone under flickering monitor light. Instead, he was often home before sunset. Sometimes he cooked badly. Sometimes he just sat with his children and listened, really listened, not as a man waiting to speak, but as a father who had learned what it meant to be present. Astrobyte had entered a strange phase. Neither in crisis nor in celebration. It was more like a seed that had been replanted, still fragile, still uncertain, but growing. The new mission proposal came one quiet Friday afternoon. It wasn't grand, not at first glance. A team of junior engineers, those who had stayed, those who had felt the shift in Sundar's leadership, presented it shyly. A smaller rocket, lower cost, focused not on colonizing Mars, but on delivering water filtration units to remote research stations on the Moon and low-orbit refueling hubs. "It's not as sexy as Mars," one of them said, almost apologetically. But Sundar's eyes lit up. "No," he said, "it's better." He meant it, because this wasn't about headlines. It was about people, about building things that made a difference here, not just there. He greenlit the mission on the spot. The media reaction was mixed. Some called it a step back. Others said Astrobite was playing it safe. But within the company, something changed. Engineers who had been burned out began staying late, not from pressure, but because they believed again. They brought their families to weekend showcases. There were open brainstorming nights, laughter in the cafeteria. Someone even brought in a dog. Sundar didn't ask why. He just scratched its head and kept walking. Then came a quiet knock at the company's glass doors late one evening. A woman, older, tired-looking, but sharp-eyed. Her name was Dr. Rosalind Tam, an astrophysicist who had spent most of her career ignored by major space agencies because her proposals were too ground-level. She had heard about the shift at Astrobite, the humanity-first mission. She had an idea. Not to leave Earth, she said, but to heal it. Her team had developed a satellite prototype that could help monitor wildfires in real time, adjusting prediction models with machine learning algorithms fed directly by field-level sensor data. It had never been funded. Too small. Too humble. Sundar listened, not because it promised billions, but because it made sense. Astrobite offered to fund the first launch. Quietly. No fanfare. No sponsorship deals. When it succeeded, wildfire response times in California and parts of Australia dropped by 17%. It wasn't glamorous, but it saved lives. And people noticed. One by one, the world began to shift its gaze. Not with fanfare, not with frenzy, but with respect. Investors who had left began calling again. But Sundar didn't answer them first. He called the school janitor whose daughter had drawn a model of a healing rocket and invited them to see the launch. He reached out to a small rural school in India, donated a telescope, and live-streamed a classroom Q&A with engineers who had once studied there. He wrote hand-signed letters to the families of employees who had worked weekends and holidays for the old Mars mission, apologizing, thanking, honoring. He didn't rebuild Astrobite the way most people rebuild companies. He didn't cut corners or slash staff or rebrand with new logos and glossy slogans. He rebuilt it from the inside out. He didn't just want to go back to space. He wanted to rise with meaning. And slowly, the pieces came together. A new generation of scientists joined the company, drawn not by salary, but by the promise of vision with values. Astrobite became the first private company to partner with global humanitarian orgs to use its tech in disaster relief. Not because it was good business, but because it was good. And then one night, sitting on the couch next to his children, watching old documentaries about space travel, Sundar felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not pride, not adrenaline, but peace. That peace deepened the next morning when he received a message on his phone. It was from Layla. "Good morning. I know things are still healing between us, but I wanted to say thank you for everything. And also, if you're free for dinner tonight, the kids would love it. I would too." He stared at the screen for a long moment, then smiled. Typed back, "I'll bring dessert." That night, as the sun dipped behind the golden rooftops, and laughter filled the small kitchen once broken by silence, Sundar looked at the people who mattered most, their faces glowing in candlelight, their voices soft, their love never fully lost. He had missed so many dinners, but not this one. And somehow, that meant more than any launch ever could. Because for the first time in his life, he realized it wasn't the rocket that made him powerful. It was the ability to choose when to step out of it and stay grounded with the people who give your dreams their wings. A legacy beyond gravity. It was launch day again. But this time, the air didn't hum with anxiety. It moved gently, like a breath held and slowly released. Inside Astrobyte's control center, the mood was not one of pressure, but of quiet hope. The mission was smaller than the last. No cameras flashing, no celebrities seated in the front row. Just scientists, engineers, volunteers, and families gathered in folding chairs around screens. The payload wasn't a rover or colonization module. It was a collection of humanitarian tech, water purifiers, solar communication drones, and a micro-satellite program to beam education content to remote communities on Earth. It was called Project Ashra, named after a Sanskrit word meaning hope reborn. Sundar stood at the back of the room, not on a podium, not at the front. Just a man in a soft gray sweater, holding a paper cup of tea and watching the final countdown begin. His children were beside him, dressed in matching navy blue Astrobyte jackets. Annika was holding a tablet. Arav had drawn crayon stars on his father's name tag. Rihan, now old enough to understand how close he had once come to losing all of this, simply leaned his shoulder against Sundar's without saying a word. 10, 9, 8. The countdown rolled forward. A voice came through the speakers, clear, calm, steady. Ignition sequence start. Outside, the rocket lifted slowly from the pad, rising into the morning sky with a gentle roar. It wasn't the fastest or largest they had ever built, but it flew straight, clean, purposeful. Inside the room, no one clapped right away. They just watched a dream reshaped by love leave the Earth for the first time since everything changed. Sundar's eyes glistened, not because of the rocket's success, but because of what it represented. Not glory, not redemption, but balance, the kind he had once believed was impossible to achieve. After the launch, people stayed. They talked, laughed, shared stories. Interns shook hands with senior engineers. Cafeteria cooks posed for photos with mission specialists. The gap between title and team had disappeared. As the crowd began to thin out, a small group of students approached Sundar. They had won a science scholarship program Astrobyte had recently launched for underfunded schools. The youngest among them, a shy girl named Maya, held out a worn notebook. "Can you sign this?" she asked. "You're the reason I want to build things one day. Not just rockets, but things that matter." Sundar knelt slightly and smiled. "Promise me something," he asked. She nodded. "Whatever you build, make sure it brings people together." She smiled back and whispered, "I will." Later that night, Sundar returned home. The house was warm, filled with quiet music and the smell of something baking. Layla was in the kitchen, humming softly to herself, placing dishes on the table. They hadn't talked about reconciliation much, hadn't labeled anything. But they shared space again, shared parenting, shared smiles. And in time, they had begun to share dinners like this. No longer rare, no longer tense. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And it was enough. The kids gathered around the table. They ate, laughed, fought over the last slice of roti. Sundar found himself watching them more than eating, trying to absorb every second, every joke, every side glance, every bit of life he had once missed while chasing distant stars. After dinner, as the kids disappeared into their rooms, he walked out to the backyard and sat beneath the tree they had planted years ago when Rihan was born. The leaves rustled softly above, and the sky stretched wide with stars that once called to him like a siren song. But tonight, they felt closer, not because he was trying to reach them, because he had brought something human into their orbit. Behind him, Layla stepped outside, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. "You okay?" she asked. He nodded, just remembering. She sat beside him, didn't say anything at first, then quietly said, "You know, I used to resent the sky. It took you from us." He looked at her. "I know. But now," she continued, "I think you just had to go that far to realize what you had right here." He smiled softly. "And you waited for me to come back." She shrugged. "I wasn't waiting. I was living. But I never closed the door." He reached over and gently took her hand. "I'm not leaving again," he said. "Not like that." She nodded. "I know." The stars shimmered above, not as destinations, but as reflections, tiny reminders that even the farthest dreams need something real to come home to. And in that moment, Sundarpichai, the man who had once built machines to defy gravity, finally understood what legacy truly meant. Not a name on a rocket, not a title on a building, not even a chapter in history, but the people who whisper your name when they feel safe. The family who remembers your presence more than your presentations. The child who dreams because you showed them it's okay to fail, to fall, to feel, and still rise again. Astrobyte would continue. Missions would launch. Tech would evolve. Accolades might return. But Sundar didn't measure success in launches anymore. He measured it in dinners shared, voices heard, lives touched, and he would spend the rest of his life building not just for the stars, but for the hearts that beat quietly here on Earth. Because in the end, the most powerful rocket he ever launched was the one fueled by love, and aimed not at the sky, but straight into the soul of what it means to truly live.